How's it going, everyone? So a couple days ago, I unveiled SilviCultural, which is a community and platform for forest management. And what I wanted to do today is demonstrate some of the capabilities of the tools and software on that platform. But for today, what I really wanted to focus on is the SilviCultural mapping application. So I'm out here in a relatively unfamiliar piece of land, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to map this parcel. I'm going to look for the boundaries, I'm going to map out the stands, and then based on my observations in the field, I'm going to map out my treatment plan for this area for the next few decades. But before I begin, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the property because it's really cool. This farm and forest has been in the family since, I believe, 1783. And which family is that? Well, that would be the family of my brother-in-law. So this acreage, which by the way is in New Hampshire, really is quintessential family forest ownership. And because it belongs to the family of my brother-in-law, this is the land that my sister and my niece will also be involved in managing. And this is still very much a working farm and forest. They raise livestock, they have a very active maple sugaring operation, and they have occasional timber harvests. So as we go forward in devising this plan, that's what we have to keep in mind. The owner is very interested in keeping this forest and farm functional for generations to come. So I have the aerial imagery that I exported as a geotiff from SilviCultural, and I can use this with my phone's GPS to record tracks. So the first thing I'm going to do is record the property boundary. So let's get started. All right, so we're at the point where we're going to start off, and as you can see, we're kind of at the bottom of a pasture here. And lo and behold, here we are at the bottom of a pasture. Now, because this is New England, we are very lucky because we have a very nice rock wall to follow for the property boundary. So on the southeastern side, we have a rock wall. The back of the property, we have a road as a boundary, and on the other side, we have a rock wall as all. So mapping out the boundary should be pretty simple. So we'll do that and go from there. So seeing how this is my starting point, all I have to do is hit record GPS tracks, and I have this set to take a point every 30 seconds so I don't get too messy with all the points. And I just start tracking. And there we are. Now we just start walking. So as I'm going along here, remember I said this farm has a very active maple sugaring operation. So we have all these sap lines here, which are kind of cool to see, but they can create a little bit of a difficulty walking around, but it's not too bad. Can't complain too much because having a rock wall to follow makes this all very simple. All right, so we made it out here to the back line, which is this unimproved road back here. And now I just need to follow this until I get to the other side. But as you can see, we got a nice track right there. It kind of curved down south at one point, and then it continued on. There's a little blip right there because there was a swamp, so I had to walk around it a little bit. But so far, so good. Let's continue. All right, so we have the boundaries all laid out and that's looking nice. So the next thing to do is delineate the stands. So these are distinct forest communities that might be separated by species composition, harvest history, age, attributes like that. And I'm gonna go back out to the entrance because this area up here has been used for grazing, so it has very distinctive features that differ from the rest of the forest, and there's an easy boundary there. And then we'll come in here to the sugar operation. All right, so we're out here in the northernmost area of the forest, and this is really where the farm meets the forest. This is area that has historically been used for grazing. They have some cows and sheep that have been out here. I think just the sheep, but don't quote me on that. And really the result of that has been a fairly poor quality forest. They have been managing it, it looks like, to favor the maple to expand the sugar bush. But for the most part, we just have immature, low-density trees with an understory that is just covered with bayberry and other invasives, bayberry and juniper mostly. And the cool part, though, is we do have a little section of basically ancient apple orchard. So here we have an area of apple trees. Now, the owner isn't sure if these were wild or if they were planted at some time, possibly for cider production. Who knows? They're not edible apples. And based on their arrangement, I would say they were probably planted at some point in time. And for the most part, they are still productive. I wish you guys could actually smell this. There's nothing I love more than the smell of apples that have started to fall off the tree. You kind of get that rotten apple smell, which sounds gross, but it's really the smell of a quintessential New England childhood, so it brings back a lot of memories for me. Aside from that, we really don't have a whole lot going on with this little area. And it is also quite wet. We're in semi-drought conditions right now, so it's not obvious walking through here that it's swampy ground, but we can see the remnants of ash trees that I suspect were taken out by emerald ash borer. Let's go check those out real quick and see if we can see any signs of it. So the telltale sign of emerald ash borer is you have D-shaped holes because it's a flat-headed borer. So if you can, I'm not sure how well you can see that. It's kind of an abstract thing anyway. But the holes kind of have a flat edge to them. And that is a pretty good sign that it's emerald ash borer. And if we look around, we can see that, that's a decent example right there, maybe. But this tree is just covered with them. So all those holes eventually just severed the cambium essentially and killed the tree. And unfortunately, that's a fate that's going to come of most ash trees in the eastern United States. I have a lot of green ash on my land, and they're beautiful trees. They grow well. They're great for firewood. But I don't really want to manage them because I know that this is what's going to happen in the future. And it's been happening quite quickly to the areas where emerald ash borer has been taking over. So I don't expect those trees to survive 30 years from now. So the question remains how exactly I would manage this area. And the answer is I would manage it by doing nothing, but also something. And what I mean by that is in terms of harvests or any sort of large scale activity, nothing needs to be done here. We have a lot of immature timber. They're fairly good species that are growing, and we just want to leave those be. There's really no need to take anything else down. We just want to let them grow. However, the rest of this area could be described as an environmental disaster. The invasive barberry in here really has overtaken the majority of space, and it has basically made navigation through this area very difficult, painful, and most of all unenjoyable. And I want to be able to enjoy my land if I were the landowner. I want to come out here, especially if I have a kid, I want them to be able to run free. And this barberry is an incredible inhibition to that. Moreover, this is incredibly important habitat. This is something that I would describe as like, I don't know, southern New England field edge or something. You have a lot of herbaceous species that are incredibly important to wildlife, including the apple trees, which provide tremendous wildlife habitat to birds and deer. And in fact, the New Hampshire Fish and Game Commission, I think that's what it's called, they actually release pheasants, and apparently the landowner's been getting some pheasants around here. So those apple trees provide phenomenal wildlife habitat and a food source. And especially with the milkweed, like I kind of have a personal attachment to milkweed. When I was a kid, every fall, I would always capture some monarch butterflies and watch them metamorphosize into butterflies. And I know Scott, my brother-in-law, was interested in getting his daughter, Sylvie, out here so she could kind of learn to appreciate and love the outdoors like he does. And so a part of that is passing on some of those generational memories. Now, whether or not Scott wants to collect butterflies, that's his prerogative. But my point is, I want to enhance the natural habitat here to really bring out the beauty inherent in New England forests. So my primary objective with this area would be to come out here to remove some of these invasives that are choking out the native vegetation. And you would do that through probably both mechanical and chemical means. What does that mean? Well, mechanical, simply put, is just coming out here and cutting it out, whether with a brush saw or however you wanted to do it. Chemical would mean some sort of herbicide application. Now, to be honest with you guys, I am not familiar with barberry. This isn't my home state here. I'm from Maine. We have a lot less issues with invasives for whatever reason, probably just because it's colder. So in terms of a chemical prescription there, I would have to do some research. And I know there are a lot of viewers and other landowners out there that are very against the use of chemical herbicides on their property. And I understand that. If you don't want to use them, go right ahead. In my opinion, our forests are under constant threat from diseases and invasives that they never had to deal with and adapt to before 100 years ago. And herbicides are a very potent tool, in some cases, realistically, the only tool we have to combat those. And so a limited, conscientious, and targeted application of herbicides against these invasives is a net good. But in terms of mapping, what do I have to do here? Not much. It's low density enough that I can see everything from the aerial imagery, so I can just easily delineate things when I get home. However, there is a rock wall that comes through here, and I'm just going to lay a quick line there so I know where that is. So I'm still following that rock wall here, but just a note, I did come across a water feature. It looks like a stream that kind of flows through here. So I'm just gonna make note of that, and I'm kind of putting a blue point every time I cross something like this, and eventually I'm gonna connect them together so I know where the streams are running through the property. So now we are here in the idyllic sugar bush, a stand of red and sugar maple managed for the production of maple syrup. Now, maple syrup production is a cash cow for this farm, and the management of the sugar bush is incredibly important to the family. Luckily, they've done an astounding job managing it. This is just an absolutely beautiful stand. It's fairly low density, but not overly low. The crowns are beautiful and full. There's plenty of room for every tree to grow. This is great. The question is whether or not there's anything that needs to be done in here, and if not, at what point in time will something have to be done in the future? And my initial assessment of that is no. I think this is just about perfect right now. Our basal area is sitting right around 70 to 80 square feet, which is just about perfect for what you'd expect after a thinning. Now, of course, with a sugar bush, there are a few extra considerations that you'd want to keep in mind. Sugar production is a function of foliar area, so you want to make sure the crowns are as full as possible, but you also don't want there to be too much empty space because that would be inefficient. So you want to strike that perfect balance where the canopy is closed, but the trees aren't competing with each other to the degree that it's causing any sort of crown recession. And that's exactly where we are. I mean, the crowns are fairly full. We're probably getting a 50% live crown ratio with the maples, which is perfect. But because we want to strike that delicate balance, we'd probably err more to the side of smaller, more frequent harvests if there is enough development, enough space within the stand to prevent the damage of residual timber. And that's exactly what we see. There's plenty of trails in here. They are using small machinery. So it doesn't harm anything to do small and infrequent harvests. So that being said, I would probably come in here in about 10 years and remove maybe 10 to 15% of the stand, focusing on capturing the mortality of the older declining maples, and also removing some of the poor quality non-sugar producing species in here. For example, there's a pretty knotty pine right ahead of me here. I'll show you. So I'm not sure how well you can see it, but in front of us we have an old weevilled pine tree that's never going to amount to anything and has no value. Moreover, it's competing with our sugar producing species, so it doesn't really have any purpose except for biodiversity. And this is a pretty small area, so I don't really think we have to look at this stand in terms of biodiversity when the macro can kind of take care of that for us, if that makes sense. So that's what I'd say for this stand. We're going to maintain the status quo, continue to produce maple syrup every year, and then come back around 2035 and reassess and see if it would be a good time to do a light thinning or improvement cut of sorts. All right, so that does it for the sugar bush. I got the rock wall earlier, and that kind of is going to work as our stand line because I think that's basically the line of management right there. So over time, it has just resulted in a difference in stand composition. So now we're going to head to this area right here, which is more of a mixed wood stand. You got a lot of pine, you got some oak, and you got some maple. So let's check it out. And just to give you guys an example of what I mean in the difference of management, here is the sugar bush that it's been actively managed as such. Then we have the rock wall. And then over here, we can tell that it is much more dense and there's more diversity of species. So let's continue on. All right, so this area is a lot denser. We're getting about 140 square feet of basal area, which is considerably denser than the last stand, which is to be expected. And what I'm seeing is that we're skewing more towards pole-sized timber. And there's actually some really good quality growing stock in here. We have a lot of red oak, we have a lot of sugar maple, decent amount of red maple too, but it's generally good quality stuff. However, what we also have a lot of is a lot of declining intolerance. We have some pin cherry, we have some white birch that's reaching its age limits, and so forth. And all those trees are starting to compete with the good quality growing stock. So what I would recommend for treatment in here, basically ASAP, would be to do a selection cut focused on increasing the quality of growth. So really focus on grabbing some of those intolerants, those white birch and pin cherry individuals, and even some of the poor quality tolerance. So the poor quality sugar maples and so forth that don't show much promise. If we can do that and remove about 40% of standing volume, we're going to have a beautiful and productive stand that is going to produce some high quality timber into the next 50 years or so. And while doing so, it's actually going to increase some of the potential for the sugar bush, because a lot of those sugar maple and red maples are going to continue growing, and maybe in the future that can expand into this area if they deem it economic. So this area to me is fairly simple, so we're going to move on, but there has been a micro harvest conducted a little bit to the east. So let's go check that out and map it out. So off to the east, we have a small area, just a few acres in size, that is basically a micro shelterwood, as we can see by the mature trees that were left standing. And what this does is it makes an opening in the canopy that provides an opportunity for regeneration to come in. And man, it's just been working beautifully. This is a beautiful example of functional forestry. So we can see here that we have some very small white pine German oak, maybe 2 years old, that are coming in, and if we give this another 10 years, this will just be flush with regeneration, kind of like this area right here, which I'm guessing was a little bit of a pre-existing opening. Now the funny thing about this is this was a harvest conducted by my brother-in-law's brother, which might make him my brother-in-law too. Not sure how that works. Anyway, he actually now works in northern Maine for the company I used to work for as a logger, but even more humorously, he ended up marrying my cousin. So our families are pretty intertwined at this point, and I promise you that's not some like land politic thing. We aren't the Prussian monarchy, it just worked out that way. But props to him, this is beautiful. I love to see this. So I'm going to mark this out and we can have it on our map. Now here we are in kind of a unique area a little to the north of where we just were. And the problem with this area is it's pretty much all low value timber, but we have two primary components. We have hemlock and we have white pine. Now usually white pine is a great species, and actually there's a great example of one right here. Unfortunately, white pine is subject to a native pest called the white pine weevil, which tends to eat away at the terminal leader of individuals that are more exposed to sunlight, or rather the individuals that are growing more vigorously, which tend to be the ones that are grown in open sunlight. And so if a pasture is grown in or a clearing is grown in and it's growing white pine that's not under shade, typically these trees can get pretty weeviled and they tend to break off and get forked from a pretty low standpoint. So let me try to give you an example here. Yeah, so right here we have a pine tree that splits off only about 10 feet high, and then it actually splits off again to create a third fork and a fourth one about 20 and 10 feet above that respectively. So a pine tree like that just isn't going to produce any value. And then for the hemlocks, well, first of all, a lot of these individuals aren't very good quality either, but hemlock itself just is not a very valuable species. It's prone to wind shake, it's pretty brittle, and so there isn't a huge market for it. Now that said, the landowner does have a portable sawmill and he has milled hemlock in the past. And they also use firewood here to operate the maple syrup evaporators. And of course, hemlock is a terrible firewood. It's probably my least favorite thing to burn. I usually cry if I have to burn it. So basically, we just don't want to have too much hemlock growing here. Now, of course, it is part of the native ecosystem and it is important for that, from that standpoint, but we're actually heading into an area that's very, very high to hemlock, and I suspect that's actually a result of perhaps some high grading for firewood that took place in the 19th century, because again, this has been an operating farm since 1783. And back in the day, farms were pretty energy intensive. So I think probably just based on the stands on either side of the property line, they kind of took out all the hardwood. And so I would like in the long term to reduce the percentage of hemlock on this property, at least in the back. So actually what I would propose to do here in this 5 acre or so area is a white pine shelterwood. So I would like to see a lot of the hemlock and what else is there, pin cherry removed in order to produce some openings in the canopy to allow the white pine to regenerate. Now, like I said, these white pine, with the exception of this one right here, these are very low quality and low value white pine, but that doesn't mean that their seed is valueless. They can still reproduce, they can still produce some very high quality species. The only reason these species, or these individuals rather, are poor quality is because of weevil. So if we can grow them under an overstory, they're going to be at much higher quality. Now, this is going to be one of those operations that is just not very economic anywhere in the next 30 or 50 years. But this is long-term ownership. This is a long-term vision. And I actually did a video about infinite games and how that pertains to forestry. If you're the type of landowner that wants to pass on your land to your children, then you got to be thinking more long term. And this is the exact sort of opportunity that you could grab onto and say, well, this isn't going to be very economic right now. I might have a very hard time even getting rid of this timber, let alone making money off of it. But I know in the long term, I can kind of transition the composition of my forest into something that will be more valuable and produce more valuable for my children and their children. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna map that out, then we'll move on. And as I'm laying that area out, I came across this giant oak tree. So that'll be a great opportunity for this oak to spread its seed as well, and we can get a larger component of oak in the stand. All right, so I'm in the second to last stand toward the back, and this area is incredibly difficult for a couple of reasons. One, it is very heavy to hemlock, probably about 80% hemlock, and we have the same issues that I discussed earlier with the economics of hemlock, the lack of markets, etc. And these are pretty mature hemlock for the most part, so we have a lot of volume to deal with, and that can be difficult. You have to find the right market for it. Another complication is that there really isn't even too much in the realm of seed source. If I were to open the stand up, the likely thing to regenerate would be hemlock. The other difficulty is that this area is pretty far from the farm, about 1,500 feet, I believe. And so that can be difficult for machinery to bring logs all the way to the road. Now, there is a unimproved road on the other side, but it would take a lot of investment to get that to a drivable condition. And you have to go through a little bit of a swamp to get to it. So we basically have an uneconomic stand of wood in an uneconomic position, and that can be hard to deal with. Luckily, this is pretty low priority. There's nothing about this stand that presents a huge issue, so this can stay for even decades without much issue. Just there's going to be a little bit of an opportunity cost, but there's just not a whole lot of opportunity to begin with. But that's actually the good thing about forestry, is even when something is high priority, rarely is something actually an emergency. Trees will continue to grow if you're not taking action. And so the worst case scenario is that if you wait too long, you're going to have a little bit more wood. Now, in some cases, you might have increased mortality, like if it's a salvage cut or something like that. But generally speaking, nothing is an emergency. So I think how I would approach this stand is to implement a group selection, but you'd have to wait for the right opportunity. So what that would entail is basically creating small openings, maybe an acre or two in size, around some groups of maybe not ideal, but better than hemlock species. So for example, there's a pretty big red maple right beside me here, and maybe we could get a little more diversity in the stand and a little more red maple if there was an opening around some of these red maple trees, especially white pine. There's probably a handful of individuals of white pine in here, and certainly I would like to see some openings around those white pine so the sunlight can reach that regeneration and we can regenerate some white pine, because these soils just seem to want to grow white pine. Every time I see a white pine tree and I look to the ground, I can just see hundreds of little germinants around the first 50 feet or so around the tree. But I do think it would be a little bit of a waiting game, because you kind of have to have the stars align if you want it to be economic, especially when it comes to the market. Now, I really don't know what the hemlock market is around New Hampshire. I'm not familiar with this market. I know up north it is basically non-existent, and I'm sure here it is at least limited. So you have to wait for a time when there is a market and you have somebody to cut it. And, I think in the last decade, I can count maybe 3 times where the pulp market's been pretty good, and you would have been able to do that. But you would have had to have been prepared and ready to go when that opportunity presented itself. So sometimes as a small landowner, it's about making your own luck. All right, so now I'm in the last stand for the day at the very end, and much like the previous stand, this is a lot of hemlock. The difference is it's worse because it's smaller hemlock. Now that's both good and bad. It's bad because all the economic restrictions we had on the previous stand, we have them here, it's just more so. And it's also an upward slope, so if we assume we're bringing wood back to the farm, this is going to be very difficult. It's going to increase our cost tremendously to come up the hill with wood. So really our only option to harvest wood commercially here would be to go out to the other road, which, it's basically just your classic bulldozer road. It's just a big ditch that is barely wide enough to fit some wheels, and it's just in no state to actually haul wood off of. And currently, I don't know the situation for who would be responsible for upkeeping that or upgrading it. I can ask, but for right now, I'm just going to assume that it's not usable. Now, the good news to this is that the timber is still small enough that we can essentially do some TSI activities or pre-commercial improvements. So our options are still limited because there's just not a lot to work with. However, we do have a handful of valuable species and valuable individuals. There are a couple nice oak trees in here, there's some nice yellow birch, etc. And so if we wanted to, we can create some smaller openings to try to regenerate those species more. However, the angle I'm going to come at this from is from a wildlife standpoint. This is a really nice ridge line. There is a little bit of a stream down at the bottom, which leads to a bog. So we have kind of a corridor of water here. And more importantly, there is just deer sign everywhere, like everywhere. So I am sure this ridge is just frequented by some nice bucks. So I think it would make sense to take that attribute and run with it. This is a nice piece of land with high wildlife value, and it's far enough away from the road that you're going to exclude 80% of the competition by virtue of the fact that you have to walk a long time to get here. So that's how I'd want to manage that. And maybe that involves creating some artificial bedding areas. Maybe that involves making a food plot somewhere. I don't know, I'd have to kind of observe the herd a little more. And like I said, this is an unfamiliar piece of property. But I can tell you with 100% certainty that if this were my land, I would definitely have a stand or two back here, that's for sure. So I'm gonna call that good for now. I could go into greater detail with everything if I wanted to, like with the group selection, I could actually map out where I wanted those groups to be. However, this is more just for demonstration purposes, and it is starting to get a little late and I got more to do before I head home. So I am going to finish up everything here. I'm going to map out any water I find. I'm gonna map out any paths I cross, and then I'm gonna head back and we're going to upload this onto the computer and make a map for it. So we've collected all the data in the field, and now we're going to bring it back and upload it onto the SilviCultural mapping application, where we can further process it and digitize it so we can have a nice little map that can store and track our forest management plan. I've already exported the features on my phone and transferred them onto my computer through email, so now all I have to do is go over here and import the file. And just like that, it's populated. So when we import it, it's just going to be a generic style. And of course, because they're GPS lines, we have to do a little bit of work to get them to look nice and neat. Now, if I really wanted to, what I could do is I could just edit the vertices of these features as necessary and then change the feature type and kind of integrate them that way. But historically, what I've done and what I find to just be more convenient is to use them as a guide and digitize over them, because it's just going to save you a lot of time and hassle, and it's going to result in a better looking map. So what I'm going to do is start out with the property boundary, but before I get started, there's one feature here that I want to explain. So if you open up the Add New Object field, you can see that there's this tool here that says Use Snapping Tool. Now what the snapping tool does is it's more for tracing, and it will snap where you want to go to the vertices so you can more easily trace. So for example, this is more freehand up here, but if I use the snapping tool, it's going to snap to the vertices and I can easily trace this line boundary. Now that can be very useful if you're delineating against a line or you're within a polygon, but if you're digitizing over pre-existing lines, that's going to be quite a pain. So we're going to turn that off, and that ensures that we're just going freehand. So I'm actually going to try to digitize the entire property, and to be honest with you, I am not sure where the legal line is up here. I wasn't too concerned with that, but I just want to add it in so you can kind of see how you can integrate fields in this map as well. But I'm going to assume it's up here, and I'm going to start up by the road here and follow this wall which falls into the forest. So I think that's a pretty good indication that's where the boundary is. And we're going to digitize that. Now while I'm doing this, the controls here are pretty simple. You just click to lay a point, and then if you want to scroll, you just hold down. And then when you let go, it won't make a point. Then you can continue on. And then as you see, we can just follow over our boundary line. Now, if you want to be very precise about where that boundary is, the best thing to do would be to average a point on the corner. So with most GPS tools, you have point averaging, and it's going to sit there and just take several points and then average out your location to give you the best accuracy. Avenza can actually do that, but it's only available in the Pro version. You can also just put on a line and keep it there for a while, and it's just going to make a big ball of lines, and that's one way to do it. But anyway, you want to find those four corners, and then you can just make lines to connect the corners, and that's going to be your most accurate line. But honestly, this isn't a tool meant for surveying or anything like that. This is not what this was built for. Now right here, there was a little bit of a swamp because this is actually a water feature. So I'm going to kind of skip over that. And I'm going to exclude this field off to the east here. I'm not sure where the ownership of that is, but this is mostly conceptual. Now we're going to call this boundary line. And we can see that we can put this in a group. And I have some pre-named groups here. I have property boundary, stands, treatment history, and management plan. So I'm going to put this in the property boundary group. We're going to save that. So there is our property line to work with. So next up we're going to do stands, and I'm actually going to start by delineating this field here, and I'm going to start using the snapping tool. So I'm going to make sure that's on, and I'm going to lay out this field here. Field, and we're going to put that in the stands layer. All right. Next we have this area out to the front. I'm going to use a regular forest stands feature for this, and I'm going to turn on snapping tool again. Now I'm going to turn it off, otherwise it's going to start to snap to those features, which I don't want. Try to follow that line as best as possible. There we go. And I don't really know what to call this stand, so I'm just going to call it the grazing forest. And we're going to make sure that it is in the stands group. Next we have the sugar bush. And I'm going to start with this. It takes a little bit of finesse to use that snapping tool. You kind of got to get the hang of it. I will be honest about that. But it is extremely handy once you learn. We'll connect to there. And then I'm going to turn off this one so I can more easily connect to the lines I want to. And I don't want to bore you guys to death, so I'm just going to finish out these stands and then we'll go to the next thing. Okay, so I have all my four stands laid out, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to map out some of the features that we noted and mapped out in the field. And I'm going to start with habitats, because we noted several habitat types that we might want to manage for. So those are a good thing to map out, and those are also going to be a polygon feature. But what I'm actually going to do is I want to put those in a separate group so I can manage them as such. So I'm going to go to this empty group, and I'm going to call it habitats. And then everything that we make for the habitat features is going to be put in this group. So let's start with this front area here, and we noted several different areas, specifically two, I guess. So we have the apple orchard down here, which I'm going to mark off as a separate type of habitat because that's going to be its greatest use. Unless somebody wants to make some apple cider, then that's primarily for wildlife food. And then also these areas where it's more open, we don't have much timber growing, and those I would like to manage for some of the native herbaceous species that are important for the local ecosystems. So let's make those polygons. So let's start, you can see the orchard pretty clearly here in the imagery. And if I wanted to in the description, I could say how many trees. I didn't actually note, but I'll say like 15 trees. And I'll put that in the habitat group. And then let's do several little polygons in these areas. And there's one more, this area in the back here, which is more classified as a riparian zone, so like a stream side area. We're going to call that entire area a deer management zone. And note that because we put all those in a certain group, we can turn them all on and off at will. So let's get some of these rock walls in here. All right, now let's do the road in here, which comes in like this. Okay, so now we have all our features in, And as you can see, we have some gray for rock walls. We have a thick black line for the main road. We have a yellow line for some substantial trails. And of course, we have blue lines for streams. Now we can really start digitizing the management plan, which is to say we can start making some polygons for past and future treatments. And I want to start with the past treatments. So again, we'll start out here in the front. Now we do know that it has been cut to favor some red and sugar maple. I don't know what years those have been managed, but I think probably we're looking at like 2015-ish, just by the looks of the stumps. So I'm going to go ahead and digitize that, and I'm just going to have the entire area. So I'm going to call it a thinning. Okay, so we have that in there. I put it in as a maple release. And next we're going to make a polygon for the main sugar bush. And I'm probably going to call it much the same, but I just want to have a polygon in there to show that it is being managed. Okay, and then finally I want to mark out the little micro shelterwood that we delineated. So that would be this right here. Pretty small when you look at the tracks. And actually, I want to change this to selection. I put it down as a thinning, but selection I think will probably make more sense. That way we can get 3 different prescriptions in the treatment history. Okay, so there we have the treatment history, and again, we have that all in a separate group. So all I have to do is just hit this, and I can turn those on and off. So I can turn off my treatment history, I can turn off my habitats, etc. I can even turn off all my features if I want. And now we're actually going to do our management plan, which is to say our plans for the future. So to do this, I am actually going to turn off the treatment history so it doesn't get too messy. And I'm probably going to turn off the features too, just because it's going to make things a little bit more difficult. So we have a bit more of a clean map to work with. Oh, my habitats too. I'm going to turn those off. All right, I'm going to start out front here, and this was an area where we didn't have to harvest any timber because it's very young and low density. But we do have 3 important habitat types that we want to manage for, and it is inundated with invasives, specifically barberry. And we want to do some mechanical removal and then some chemical herbicide treatment. Mechanical because there's a lot of thorns and it's hard to move around in there. But if we cut it without actually killing the main organisms, it's just going to sprout back. So we want to do a cut stem application of an herbicide. And it's pretty spread throughout this entire area, so I'm just going to mark off this entire block here as a chemical herbicide treatment for, we'll say next summer in 2025. All right, next up we have the sugar bush, and I'm going to put that in as a reassessment for 2035. So I don't really want to commit to doing anything in 2035 because we might not need to. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, is just because you're writing something down in a plan doesn't necessarily mean that you have to stick to it, because sometimes the most potent tool you have as a land manager is nothing, just keeping your hands off of it. All right, so we have the Mixedwood pole stand here, but actually the next thing I'm going to put in is the white pine shelterwood that I propose. So the reason is that's more on the edge and it's going to make it easier to delineate. There we go. So there it is, and I'm probably just going to attach it to the edge of the property line and the stand here just to make it a little more feasible. And it's going to be a shelterwood. All right, so just the easy polygon there, and then from there we can put the selection cut around it, but I'm going to turn off the KML lines again because they're going to get in the way. And keep in mind, like, so obviously they have been logging this themselves for the most part, and this is a pretty big area right here. So if you wanted to, you can map this out as separate management units, just for practicality purposes. In this instance, I'm just going to manage it all as one unit, but honestly, if this were my land, I would probably be making a bunch of smaller little parcels like this, because that's about the size I'd be conducting my harvests every year. But just, again, this is all conceptual. Okay, so again, I'm just being very simplistic here. This was the area that is basically uneconomic timber. It's a lot of hemlock, and over the long term, I would really like to regenerate species like hardwood and white pine in here and reduce the composition of hemlock. But it has to be more opportunistic. And this is a 9-acre patch, which is, relatively small. But if you're just a small manager and you're doing things yourself, this can still be a fairly large patch, and so it would be probably best to break this down, lay out those groups individually, and micromanage this area so you can take advantage of management opportunities when they arise. Okay, guys, well, that's that. That's pretty good for a day in the field. We have a nice mapped out management plan for our land. And of course, what I can do with this now is I can export it as a geotiff and then go back out in the field and use this map with all the features on it. So for example, if I'm looking at this area and I say, well, I have a shelterwood in my past treatments, I have a shelterwood plant here. It's like, well, maybe I could make this into something else. So I can use this map and go back and look at this area because it looks like there's some mature timber in here. Maybe I can make another little group right here to make this more of a cohesive management block. But anyway, my point is this. Every one of you, if you own land, should have a management plan with this level of granularity. And I know a lot of you guys have management plans written up, oftentimes if only for legal purposes, because some states require that as a prerequisite for enrollment in certain tax advantage programs. But they are, in most cases, pretty vague, and they certainly don't describe things with any level of detail or granularity. And you really should be looking at your land at this level. You should have certain areas that are, maybe only an acre in size that you might have set aside for certain management purposes, like, this herbaceous management area right here, for example. And so that's really what I wanted to demonstrate by using this mapping application to make a management plan today. This is exactly what it was designed for. This was designed with the small forest landowner in mind. And so it is now available to you guys through SilviCultural. So if you enjoyed this video, if this is something that you think would be useful for you or a function that you would like to utilize on your land, be sure to check it out. I'm going to have a link down in the description and pinned in the first comment below. So please go and give that a look. It is silvicultural.com. And of course, I have more videos coming to demonstrate further capabilities of the platform, so stay tuned. I'll see you guys later.